All right, welcome everybody to our joint webinar today from the Business Education Special Interest Group and the Learning Analytics Special Interest Group of ASCILITE. For all those people who are new to the SIGs, membership to any of the SIGs is absolutely free. You don't need to be an ASCILITE member. Check out whether your institution is one of ASCILITE's institutional members, where you may be able to join absolutely free of charge. And membership also comes in 1 and 3 year, I think, options for individuals who want to join ASCILITE as well. I'm in the process of trying to convince my institution to join as an institution, so that's always an option. But today, my name is Amanda. I teach accounting. I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney. We have with us Linda Corrin from Swinburne, Hazel Jones from Griffith, who you may know. She's a long-time ASCILITE volunteer, and Sreko from the University of South Australia. I'm from the Business Education SIG, and Linda, Hazel, and Sreko are from the Learning Analytics SIG. So we just wanted to start the session today with an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Barong Barol people of the Darug Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the UTS campuses now stand. And we would also like to pay respect to elders both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for these lands, and acknowledge that we're on lands never ceded. I also welcome you to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where you are coming from today in the chat. I know that this is a uniquely Australian thing that we tend to do, an acknowledgement of country. It's not something done everywhere around the world, but as we learn and start to integrate more Indigenous perspectives into the work that we do at universities, for us at UTS, we think it's really important. So thank you to all those people paying their respects to the people, the traditional owners of the lands on which they are coming from. So what are we going to talk about today? I know we planned this out for about 50 minutes because we want to give people just that short lunchtime webinar. Done our introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this idea is of a pedagogy of care and challenges for business schools. Our learning analytics team are going to talk about what are learning analytics and what can and can't they do. Examples of how we can use learning analytics to provide care and feedback. Factors you should consider when using learning analytics, and then some open Q&A as well. So you can think about your questions and potentially post them in the chat. So, done introductions. So what does pedagogy of care mean? And I think with COVID-19, we've seen an increased focus on the importance of the well-being of students and the role that academics and universities and staff within universities play in this role in giving care. This is something I've believed in for a really long time, in which sometimes colleagues would say, oh, but Amanda, we have hundreds of students or thousands of students. How can you provide care for them all? You know, I'm a content delivery specialist. I'm a subject matter expert. I'm not an expert in providing care and compassion to others. And so that really got me interested in this idea of the pedagogy of care and providing caregiving to students by educators and others within the university. And really for me, it's not just that, you know, in the past we've always provided care around academic performance, but also around the idea that we're caring for students from a well-being perspective as well. So for all these people who might be fans of hybrid pedagogy, who might have been looking into the work of Jesse Stommel and others from the hybrid pedagogy and the digital pedagogy groups, anybody who might know the work of Sarah Goldrick-Rabb in the United States about real college and the idea that, you know, we're teaching the whole student, not just the academic part of them, but we have the whole student in our classrooms. To me, that idea of caring, you know, sort of came as a bit of second nature. It was something I always did, and I was really interested to find that there is actual discussion and pedagogy in regards to this. We'll also post these slides up on the ASCILITE page with the video recording so that you'll be able to click on the links here, but I've included 3 resources if you want to read into a bit more about how we can provide care and what care actually looks like. I've put 3 great resources on there. So one is about, is caring pedagogy really so progressive? So exploring the idea of providing care in higher education. Maha Bali, who you may know online or on Twitter, she's fantastic. Talks about pedagogy of care in 2015, actually pre-COVID, in relation to MOOCs. On her own blog, she also talks about pedagogy of care in terms of caring for our colleagues as well, as a really important part of maintaining connection and feeling of belonging. You may have heard about the ideas around belonging, partly from transition pedagogy by Sally Kish, but belonging drives student engagement. When students feel like they belong, they're much more willing to engage, they're keen to engage, and that engagement can really support academic performance. And another one I've added there is James Lang. James teaches at a college in the United States or a university in the United States, and he's written a whole lot of books on small teaching practices. So not large overall teaching practices, but little things that you can do that create care and connection within the classroom, on scale as well as in small groups. So what are the challenges faced by business schools? Business schools, especially in Australia, we have smaller numbers of universities than in other countries. That also means our universities tend to be a little bit larger. My own institution has about 35,000 students as an enrollment. If you look at universities like Monash, it's quite a bit more than that. But we have relatively large numbers in business schools at most universities. Students come from a wide variety of backgrounds, including cultural backgrounds that have different approaches to showing care. So sometimes students don't realize, oh, somebody is trying to care for me. And so sometimes that could be really interesting. We've been highly impacted by border closures, which means we've had significant numbers of students offshore feeling quite isolated, away from their peers who might be studying here domestically, not getting to speak English as much as they might like. Students attend a mix of on-campus and online, which we're seeing in a transition return to campus. And then business school students, the revenue from business schools and commerce faculties cross-subsidize a lot of other faculties. So there's a history of receiving less budgeted funds in comparison to the contribution of their income, which is often, we've all felt this across all of higher education right now, which is do more with less. A really good example is I currently teach a subject, or I'm about to start teaching a subject that has just hit 1,600 students. I run 75 tutorials. I have a really large tutorial team of first-year students, and trying to figure out how I can provide care to these students to help them feel like they belong, that I'm trying to do as much as I can to support this at university, is totally overwhelming. I thought, how am I going to do this? And how this webinar came into play is because the Learning Analytics SIG at the last conference ran a really great session on using learning analytics and what they can and what they can't do. And I went to that session because I wanted to figure out how could I provide care on a massive scale. And that's where sort of this webinar has come about. So these are a lot of the challenges faced by business schools, but probably across a whole range of different other faculties. We're all asked to do more with less, whether that's less time, less professional support across the universities. There's less is doing more on the smell of an oily rag is pretty common across a number of institutions. And I'm sure people are feeling the same where they might be. So now I'm going to hand over to the Learning Analytics team to talk a little bit about what is this thing? You might have heard a lot about learning analytics before, not exactly sure where to start, what to look at, what is included. They're going to tell us a little bit more about what are learning analytics.
Thanks, Amanda. So just to also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose lands I am currently sitting at the moment. So that was a really great introduction, I think, to the context and especially what it means in the context of business education. I was having a quick squiz at who's actually here with us today, and I can see very, very seasoned learning analytics professionals, but also a lot of people I don't know as well. So I'm going to keep this fairly general about what learning analytics are. So for some of you, you'll know this, but for some of you, this might be the first time you're hearing it. But learning analytics, really, it's just about using the data that we collect about our students. So it's what they're doing, in our learning systems. It may be some demographic data about them. It may be the feedback data that they give to us, all the different sources of data that we have around students, and using that to improve educational context and the way that we teach our students and support our students. So for the context of what we're talking about today, the pedagogy of care, it's really interesting to think about, normally when we're talking about learning analytics, we're talking about how do we use data about students to improve their academic outcomes, their performance, all of those sorts of things. But it's interesting too, because a lot of what drove learning analytics to emerge as a field, and it really emerged roughly sort of 2011, that was when the first big conference was. But I guess we've been using data about students for years and years and years, but I think it's a little bit more systematic in how we approach it now. But we can use this sort of data to some extent to look at how we support students. And as I said, it came out of that idea of the how do we keep students there as well. So the idea of retention. So how do we identify students who might be struggling in their studies? And then what kind of interventions can we make to help them to succeed? Now, of course, that also fits beautifully with the pedagogy of care, because we want to make sure that we're supporting our students and we are giving them the best environment for them to succeed within. But I think it probably goes a little bit more than that. So the questions that we sort of had here about, well, what can learning analytics do? Well, it can tell us a lot about what a student does. So it's very behavioural in a lot of ways. So a lot of the data that we get, or that's easy to get, I guess, about students are things like, did they log in? Did they complete that formative quiz that we gave them online? Have they submitted their assessment on time? And what was their eventual mark? All of those sorts of things. And you can use those data to try and understand the patterns of engagement that students have. So learning analytics, I guess, tells us a lot about what students do and the outcomes that they achieve by doing that. It doesn't always help us understand how they learn. It's a bit of a proxy for learning. And that's where I think there's a lot of faith put into learning analytics, but when you really dig into it, it's a lot more complex than that. Now, that's not to be all pessimistic about it. There's an awful lot of wonderful things you can learn from learning analytics and things that you can understand. And, we can look at certain patterns of behavior to work out, well, what is a good way for students to approach their studies? How can we use this data, for example, to support our students in how they self-regulate their own learning as well? So there's lots of different things. We can use predictive analytics, which for those of you in the audience who know me well, I am a little skeptical of, but there are some uses where predictive analytics are really important. And actually, when we're talking about pedagogy of care, there's some interesting conversations we could have around predictive analytics and helping to support and nurture and retain our students. So I'm not going to go into too many specific details. Shreko and Hazel will do that after I've finished talking. But I guess that last question about what can't they do, one of the things about learning analytics is it tells us part of the story. So in order for us to know the whole story, we would have to be tracking absolutely everything our students do and think and all of that sort of stuff. And not all of that happens in an environment where we're able to collect that data. So if a student happens to go to the uni bar after one of their classes and sit and talk about their lessons with their peers, they're actually learning, they're reinforcing the information that they've learned perhaps in their class, or they're helping to problem solve or support each other, but we don't capture any of that. So we don't know that that's happened. So I guess when we're looking at learning analytics, we sort of get part of the story, and depending on how we've designed what we're asking our students to do. So you'll hear a lot of learning analytics people talk a lot about the concept of learning design being really central to us being able to understand what the data actually means. So if we set up a really robust learning design where analytics are generated at certain points that really give us an indication of whether a student has understood a topic or whether they've engaged in a particular activity, then you're able to sort of get a reasonable picture, but there's always going to be those missing things in between. And I guess one of the things that's really relevant about that for the pedagogy of care is the fact that often when you're talking about supporting students, and especially when you're talking about, say, supporting students emotionally or from a mental health perspective, because we know that unfortunately our students are experiencing a lot higher levels of anxiety and mental health issues, especially in the last 2 years with the COVID situation. So some of the things that might give us an indication that those problems are emerging, we don't capture. they're things that are very personal. They're things that are very separate sometimes to what the students are doing in their actual study. But they're really important because they impact the ways that students are motivated, or how they engage, or whether they even have the capacity to engage with learning at particular points. So I guess one of the things that we need to have a think about here is, how much do we want to collect? You know, and we don't want to be too big brother-ish, but we do want to be able to identify when students do need help, and we need to be able to have the sort of support services that we can offer that help. Some of that can be offered by the teacher, and some of that I think does need to be more professionally driven. So maybe it's the university counselling service or other professionals who are able to step in and help students in those sorts of situations. But as Amanda said before, there's lots of different ways that you can provide support and care to your students. And I'm hoping that when we get to the question and answer session towards the end, we can explore some of those in a little bit more detail. But for now, I'll hand over to my colleagues, to Shreko and Hazel, and they're going to take us through a few more examples of what these sorts of things can look like in the learning analytics space. So over to you guys.
I think it should be my turn now. Oh, yeah. Thanks a lot, Amanda and Linda. This is really great overview, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional lens of Cornell people. This was a really great introduction and great overview of the things that that Hazel and I will try to unpack a bit more. And I will, as I go through, I will try to re-emphasize some of the points raised by both Linda and Amanda. And yeah, let's see how we go there. So there have been many definitions of well-being, and while there is no single way to define well-being, there are two very broad dimensions usually taken into account when we talk about well-being. One being the emotional side, where we talk about the presence of positive emotional states and the absence of negative emotional states, and cognitive, that can be even the life satisfaction as a whole, right? So not just what we do in the class. So in the recognition of the impact that well-being has on learning, OECD started to include well-being as part of their PISA ranking assessment in 2015. And back then, they defined the well-being as the psychological, cognitive, social, and physical functioning and capabilities of the students need to live a happy and fulfilling life. Sounds magical, right? So, but this definition includes four elements. That one of them being psychological, students' sense of purpose, self-awareness, affective states, and emotional strengths. Social, where we talk about students' quality of social life, including relationship with family, peers, and teachers, as well as sense of belonging to school. Amanda touched base on this as well earlier. Cognitive, referring to students' proficiency using academic knowledge and soft skills to be lifelong learners. And physical, or the ability to follow a healthy lifestyle based on some self-reported measures, right? When you look at those four elements and the dimensions they include, we might ask ourselves, which part of those dimensions is actually captured in the learning management system that we use these days? Well, at first, it would seem like none of them, right? But technically, there are some proxies that we could use in a different range, because a wide range of data sources may be relevant for understanding mental health and well-being. For example, if you look at the learning management systems and data we collect there, we can easily understand when students change the course, drop the course, or change the program, or change something in their study, right? Or we can just follow trace data and understand when they changed their learning behavior. So these are some of the proxies that we could easily capture from learning management systems. But as Linda said, some of those sources have been collected for different purpose, and students may not expect that these are being used for understanding and informing the interventions related to well-being as well. So a lot of policies need to be put in place from the ethical and privacy perspective that would inform how we use data to understand and support well-being. But we can still do quite a bit using different applications on promoting well-being. And as Linda said, we do quite a bit of monitoring progress. And some of those indicators where we see sudden changes in how students behave might be a good indicator, good proxy for understanding their well-being as well. Minimize barriers and maximizing opportunities go hand in hand. I think we're doing quite good job, especially last several years, where we really understand, where we push towards transitioning more to online learning and being flexible in how we arrange assessment, how much time we give to students, and how much we try to support them in their learning. But there is another problem there. And both Amanda and Linda mentioned this as well. In one of the recent studies that we did in a face-to-face setting, right, in Denmark, it turns out that teachers never approach solving students' well-being problems alone. They usually talk to their colleagues, to the support staff, when they are trying to resolve some of those issues. So there are two problems here. We developed over years, we developed a lot of models for predicting student success. But even those models, when we translate them from one setting to another, does not necessarily work as we expect them to work. So we still have a lot of work to do in evaluating existing models for predicting academic performance. It's even more challenging in the case of well-being. We can definitely utilize some of the proxies we have, but those models and the data that will feed into those models need more clarity and need a lot more evaluation in practice, how these actually work. And then on top of that, most of the time, teachers will not engage, or they shouldn't maybe engage in solving those problems individually. So most of the, as GISC also made a good point in their recommendations, that all those well-being interventions should involve healthcare professionals and support staff as well, in the way how we frame those and how we approach students in supporting their well-being. On the academic side, I think we are slightly more comfortable, and more work has been done there in tracking student academic progress and informing some of the interventions. And teachers feel more comfortable in this space in, okay, this is what I want to get out of this course, this is what I want my students to learn, and I feel capable of driving them to the course. As Amanda said, sometimes we have a lot of students in the classroom, so it's really difficult to track everyone. That's why tools like OnTask from here from UniSA, or Student Relationship Engagement System out of University of Sydney are maybe two examples of very useful tools. They work in a similar way, right? They collect data in the background from the different learning management platforms and allow teachers to define different rules when certain actions will be triggered. And Lisa, I saw Lisa here. Lisa did a lot of work with OnTask, for example. But the principle is fairly simple, right? I design my course. I know if my student failed this quiz in week 2, and this quiz is fairly important for their progress, I will trigger this intervention. And that's how these tools usually work. Moodle recently developed their own plugin that does something similar like this. So it allows you basically to personalize messages that go out to students. And some of the Lisa's work from Lisa's PhD shows that students do appreciate those messages. They really, there is a huge value in that personal touch when they receive the message, hey, Linda, you did great in this assignment, you're doing great work, right? But there is something else that we also found, again, going back to Lisa's work, I talked too much about Lisa today. So students also perceive the content of the message in different ways if we frame the message positively versus if the message is just framed as okay, you failed. So we need to make sure that we structure message in a way that the message will be positive, supportive, and provides call for action. So if we just inform students that they failed, that means nothing to them, and most of the time it just has a negative impact on their learning. So it's not just about sending personalized messages, but framing those messages in a way that will give them support, not just academic, but also from the perspective of general pedagogy of care, and invite them to action. I did turn off all notifications on this platform, but not on my email. Sorry about that. Another way that wasn't very prominent in the early works of learning analytics was developing student-facing dashboards. Originally, we haven't done a lot of work in this space, but then there was a big push of getting student data back to students. And the main reason why doing so was basically to give students agency and to allow them to engage into sense making, to develop metacognition, and to develop reflection, to develop self-regulated learning in general. So the whole idea was, if we collect this data, tease out some numbers and push back to students, they will know what to do. Turns out not. Again, Joanna and her team, I referenced her work there, and Lisa as well did some work in that area. So if we simply present students with some numbers, for example, compare their performance with respect to the rest of the classroom. If they are doing good, that's okay. If they're doing worse than the average of the classroom, that has a negative impact on their learning, on their well-being, on their motivation. And it turns out that, again, students were asking more. They couldn't correctly decode the information displayed on those learning dashboards, and they couldn't put it in the context, interpret and evaluate, and inform further actions. So they saw the numbers, but they were not clear what the next step from there should be. So what students were asking basically from those student-facing dashboards was to provide more support for study planning, to provide useful recommendations, again, call for action. So if I'm here at this point, if I failed this quiz, what do I need to do to make it up for that? And how I'm gonna improve my learning. They also asked for providing help with setting goals. And they also asked, of course, with navigational support, because we all know from the online teaching and learning context that most of the discussion forum messages just go about where do I upload the assignment and how I navigate through the course, right? Very few meaningful discussion messages out there. So either way, when we talk about providing the care from the academic performance perspective, it's not really critical whether we send students an email or we provide a personalized dashboard. What really matters is what kind of message we are sending to students. So we can use different tools to personalize messages, but still those need to be informative. They need to provide call for action, and they need to provide reasonable advice what to do next. I'm just seeing a lot of messages. You can hear me, right? Oh, okay, it's just about references. Yes, I will. Lisa sent I just looked at the chat. So Lisa sent the paper I was referring to, and I will send a few more. On the slides, I just referenced Joanna's paper because that's where the dashboard is coming from. So just to summarize, it's not critical how we communicate information, whether it's visual or text or whatever. It's about what is in those messages. So Lisa, thanks for your great work. And another tool I would like to mention here is out of the University of Queensland and Hassan's group. Really amazing tool. So it also integrates with their learning management platform. But what it allows teachers to do is there are 5 broad categories that were outlined in the documentation of this tool. One being assess students on creating and evaluating study resources. Another being have students to peer review each other projects and presentations. provide students with a large bank of study resources personalized to their needs, engage students with in-class or self-paced learning activities, and help students to find their study partners. Why this is important? Well, Amanda also mentioned at the beginning that with the last few years, we have students more and more studying in flexible ways. They're not spending as much time on campus as they would or should. In that sense, this tool allows them to still engage with their peers and still get that social element that's probably missing if they're just sitting behind their screens and trying to navigate throughout the course. So very useful tool and very useful in supporting all kinds of social interactions between students and their teachers and so on. So I'm going to stop talking, but happy to address some of your questions later, and I'll try to send some of those more resources in the chat. Hazel, I think it's your turn.
Thanks, Shrika. Yeah, so what I did a quick look around in the literature, doing a search of learning analytics and pedagogy of care or student wellbeing, and there's not that much out there, and the literature is also a little bit conflicting at times. So I've just included a couple here, and I'm not going to read all of that out, but because you can do it. You can see that this is one of the issues that we have. If all we look at is the numbers, how often did a student log into the LMS or the virtual learning environment, we're not actually knowing why. And it's the why questions that are probably the most important when you're coming from this pedagogy of care business perspective. You know, is it because if a student is very active in the LMS, is it because they're a very engaged student in the first place? Is it because they're looking for something and they can't find it? Is it because they have some learning disability or hindrances that mean they've got to go back and look at things many times? And so it's a matter of being able to drill down into the right area to make sure that you're answering the right questions with the right data. And that's where it becomes much more difficult. The numbers are easy to gather in most situations, but the why and the when are more difficult. But that's where this pedagogy of care really comes into place. Because if you sent, as Shreko was saying, if you sent the wrong message to somebody who was all from a perfectionist tendency, was in there all the time and wanting to get a very good grade, then if you sent a message to them saying, you know, we notice you're in there a lot of the time, is there an issue that you have? That it might be enough to, hopefully not, but it could be enough to tip them over. So definitely that effective, what is it that you're saying in those emails and messages is really important. And this also leads to the fact that we sometimes neglect the high-performing students when we're looking at learning analytics and duty of care and a pedagogy of care, that they need just as much, if not sometimes more, care and understanding than the students who performance-wise are struggling, because they're coming in with these very high barriers and they want to keep up that thing. So it's about looking at changes in students' engagement patterns rather than the actual pattern itself. And one thing that her noticed was that looking at the timing of when students are accessing this system, and if that's getting later and later into the evening as the semester continues, does that mean that they're getting less and less sleep, so are more susceptible to the anxiety and not looking after themselves? And again, then it's a matter of what you do with that. Bearing in mind, of course, that in the current age with our digital learning, that some students actually may be from another country or even another state where the time differences come into it. So you need to understand your students at that level to be able to answer that question properly. And then from Sunderland and crew, they were asking, and apologies for the phone in the background, whose responsibility is the intervention? Is it the students or is it the staff institutions? And this comes back to some of the things Shreko was saying, and also the questions that were coming up in the chat. And I think this is where we move from it being the students' responsibility into the staff responsibility, or more importantly, the institution. We can't expect academic staff to be able to do everything. They're not counsellors, but rather than saying in one of, using OnTask or SRES or one of those, recommend that you make contact with the student support, learning support session and get some support on writing. I don't know, that's an academic side of it. It would be the pedagogy of care to me, where that would come in, is rather than sending them that email, you said, we noticed this, I'm referring you to that, and you should hear from that department in the near future. So it's taking that onus away from the student and giving the responsibility to the institution. And you can see there that they've talked about noting decreases in student engagement, and I think it goes both ways. It's decreases or increases. It's noting the differences. And if you want to look at some more about wellness things, UNE a few years ago, and Brent, you might be able to tell us whether this is still progressing, they looked at linking academic performance to wellbeing, and they had 39 different triggers that they included there, including what students' perceptions of their emotional state at a particular time was. So trying to bring some of this together, and some of you will have seen this before, this is a framework that I came up with a few years ago now to how to help academics work their way through it. So I called it the I framework, and it's a cycle, so you can keep coming back to any of these questions. But if you start off with what question is it that I'm wanting to investigate, and then what data is available to help me with that question, and it might be data outside the LMS. It could be, are students involved in clubs and societies? Are they accessing the library? Are they accessing student support? Are they accessing student counselling? And then which of those data is going to be best to help you answer the questions that you want to ask? Then how do you analyse and interpret that data in your specific context? And then what changes, interventions, actions are you going to take as a result? And then to complete the cycle, how do you know if my intervention was successful? So depending on how we're going for time, Amanda, if anybody's got an example here, I thought we could work through for a pedagogy of care. What's an example of a question that you would like to address in terms of pedagogy of care? Please feel free to speak or put something in the chat.
Yeah, we definitely do have some time, and we've got some questions as well that we can ask during the Q&A. But I think this is a really interesting framework to have somewhere to start, because a lot of times we jump into a learning analytics panel in Canvas and then you go, okay, what is it telling us, rather than that idea of what question am I wanting to investigate. And for me, it can be really simple things like, do my students feel like they belong? Or do my students feel like they, one question that we asked just using Menti was, do students feel comfortable in their classrooms, in their classes, to ask questions? because asking questions in a counselling is quite important to help clarify understanding. But it was even really simple questions like that. Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel like you belong? That could come in for a pedagogy of care if we're expressing our concern for student well-being. I don't think I've seen any others in the chat there. And I mentioned, we looked back at some of the other examples that included data about student well-being, and there were 39 points in that UNE project that was mentioned. I think sometimes it can be really difficult. I think I saw an app once where students could, on a daily basis, record their mood. And if you've used Microsoft Teams, there's an app called Reflect that you can apply into Microsoft Teams. And university students did not want to engage at all with the idea that they might send their teacher some sort of signal about their mood. Apparently they had great success with Microsoft in using Reflect with primary school students and high school students to get the mood of the class. But for university students, and I trialed this with my staff as well, I did a little session. I said, look, would you ever feel comfortable in using one of these little extensions to every couple of days just rate how you're feeling? And they said that's definitely not something. Joan has there, I'd be intrigued to know if students felt connected with their peers, with their teachers. And again, this is where sometimes perhaps entire of university programs related to transition to university, to well-being, might be one of these places where they do collect some of this data in a way that students would think would be appropriate, so that, you know, we can reach out. I'll give you an example of one that didn't do so well. We tried building, we have some automated bots on the Microsoft Lewis framework sort of system at UTS, and we built one for this introductory subject. But every time a student mentioned something related to how they felt or their emotions, the bot was programmed to automatically refer students to student counselling, so that even when the student said, I love Justin Bieber, to the chatbot, it said, if you're feeling emotional distress, you should contact the university counselling services.
Well, that would be the right response to that one, seriously.
Here are the details.
I agree.
So it can sometimes go a little bit awry, and this idea of having this framework, I think as an academic, one of the things that I find really overwhelming is, what is all the data that would be available, and who could I even find to ask about what data might be available to connect with my own data to be able to ask these questions. Sometimes when I've made inquiries, it's, okay, well, tell us what data that you would like. I'm like, I don't know, what have you got? They're like, well, we've got lots. Tell us what you need.
Yep,
it can be a bit of a circular situation to know what was successful and what was not. So I'm just going to stop this in regards to, we'll go into the Q&A. Just a reminder that I will add some links in the chat. You can join the Business Education SIG or the Learning Analytics SIGs free of charge. Our SIG membership is free. And you don't have to be a paid member of ASCILITE itself. So a lot of people don't realize that. They think they need to be ASCILITE members and then pay to join the SIGs. They're also free of charge. There was a really interesting question that had said earlier, I'm just going to find it, thoughts about personalized care activities and would they affect workload? And that's certainly something I have come across quite a lot, is I'd love to care for my students more, but I just don't have time. My workload doesn't allow for that. And this is where I think we're seeing a shift. I don't know if anybody else is seeing this, but we're seeing a shift in a definition from an academic perspective of what is expected of an academic. It used to be, you turn up to your lectures, you run your tutorials, you have your assessments. Now there are additional demands on, you need to be able to design an online interactive activity or a H5P interactive. You have to understand visual design to be able to put together a really visually appealing Canvas page. You need to understand media production. And I think this means that, we're seeing a very subtle shift in what it means to be an academic. And I know that my colleagues who are most keen to make time for pedagogy of care and to provide that caring tend to be education focused or teaching focused in their roles, because there is a little bit more time in their days to be able to do that. But I find that, you know, a lot of my colleagues who are more balanced in a 40-40-20 role say, look, I struggle. And the ones who really care about their students make time outside of their work week to be able to do it. But that sort of led to another question that somebody, I think it might have been the same person had, Karthika, which said, you know, how do we draw lines and boundaries when it comes to caring? Those of us who have children or a family member dependent on us know that there is no boundary and there is no time that says, look, there's not a time you can't contact me. But I think it's really important to set good expectations with your students about how it's appropriate to contact us, how we provide care to you, and what to do in an emergency. So I always tell my students, look, you might get me on Teams at 9 o'clock at night, but I might be asleep. Some people like to say, look, it's a business hours thing, and we use a communal shared mailbox amongst 3 staff members on a subject so that you can always get a reply reasonably quickly. But there are lots of different ways that we can convey those expectations. But I think that there certainly is, I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, I'd love to hear experiences in the chat, a greater expectation that academics and university staff are on demand, just like Netflix is on demand, or like a chatbot in a, you know, the iconic if you're online shopping or Woolworths, that there's always someone there in a chat box who can help me. I think that it's really important that also we teach students about the boundaries that you'll need to have in the professional workplaces as well as here at university, but also give students a place to call in an emergency where I say, look, if you can't get me in it's emergency and it's to do with one of these things, here's where you can go. So I think the workload impact question, I don't know, does anyone have we're trying to revamp our workload model to take into account changes in teaching and learning that have come about through COVID with more offline on-demand content viewing and changes in face-to-face time. And it's not an easy task to try and design a new workload model. And if anybody has a great workload model they'd love to share, I'd love to see it. But I think, you know, if anything from management and business management strategies told us anything, that what gets measured gets managed. And if student well-being and student care is important to universities and they make it a key performance indicator or a course indicator or a subject indicator, then, you know, it will be one of those things that universities hopefully will understand needs to go into the workload model and workload considerations. Because I can just tell now with 1,600 students, the ways that I'm trying to efficiently provide caring is something I'm trying to make sure it doesn't overwhelm me. And I don't know, I'd love to hear if anybody else has any tips or hints that they'd like to share about drawing lines and boundaries or workload. I'm happy if anybody, you can come off mute or you can pop your hand up, any of those.
Amanda, I was just going to add something. It's not about the boundaries, but it's about the role of the institution, because I think what Hazel said earlier was really important around I mean, it's been mentioned a few times, but what's the responsibility of the teaching staff member and what's the responsibility of the institution? And if we have a look to, say, our North American colleagues, a lot of that pastoral care for students actually doesn't sit on the teacher's workload. It actually sits centrally, and so each student has a dedicated career counsellor or student counsellor or whatever you want to call it that helps them across all the different subjects or units that they're doing, and it doesn't necessarily become the burden for, I shouldn't always call it a burden, but it doesn't become the responsibility of the individual teaching staff member, especially because a lot of the time when we're talking about well-being, it's not well-being just in Accounting 101. It's well-being across every unit that student is studying. It's well-being in their life in general that's impacting their entire studies. So I think there is, you know, yes, we do need to think about what the workload is for the teaching staff. And as you say, those boundaries of what you do take on and what you don't take on. I teach in a grad cert of learning and teaching. So my students are teachers, and I heard some really horrific stories last semester of people who had students reaching out to them on weekends who were basically right at the edge of doing something quite drastic. And the teaching staff member said, I can't not reply to that student. I have to do something. And that's, yes. But again, is that only because the student doesn't have anywhere else to go? Like they're coming to their lecturer in whatever unit it is, because that lecturer may have shown a little bit of compassion at one point or seemed approachable, which is lovely, but then they shouldn't necessarily need to take on the responsibility of supporting a student who is that far into a bit of a crisis. So the university needs to be able to show more visually to people that there are other places to go, and because there are places to go, but I don't know whether that message is getting through to students and whether when they are in crisis they know exactly how to get that help. So I don't know that that gives any solution to the problem, but I think it's a few things for us to consider.
It might also come down to trust, because care, with students, they reach out, and I've had more students reach out over COVID for, that they were at sort of, at a particular point where they really needed help, but they just didn't know, again, who to turn to, but they wanted to start with someone that they trusted. And so sometimes that person they trust is an academic who has reached out to them, who is using a learning analytics tool to communicate with them regularly, who is using social media or something else to create this feeling of community, which also means that we need to think about how universities create that feeling of trust and belonging to the institution. Because a lot of times I've had students, Amanda, I really feel like I connected with you, and you've done a lot to make me feel like I belong here, but I'm not sure I feel that at the whole university level, which is another really tough thing to try and nut out. Not an easy problem or solution. Antonella, I can see your hand up. Would you like to come off mute?
Sorry, yes. I was just going to say about your question of the workload and the responsibilities. I do think that that needs to be taken into account. As you were saying, the institutions need to recognise that there's much more than that people need to do now compared to, for example, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So that issue of how do we support our educators' well-being as well is really important, and I don't think we're doing nearly enough about that. But at the same time, I also think a lot of the things that we can do to support student well-being are things that are just part of good teaching. So, for example, looking at the due dates for assessment across a whole program or degree, and making sure that students don't have everything due in week 13, that's a way of supporting student well-being. And there are many other examples, like, you were talking about, for example, do we provide opportunities to interact within the classroom? Do we get students to share, what their interests are, what they love doing, do we give them options in terms of assessment to pursue their own interest, or in, doing something that's actually meaningful to them? So these are all things that, that good teachers do that supports student well-being, and they're not necessarily on top of everything else.
That's some really interesting stuff there. And I think that idea about agency, I give my third-year students a choice of 1 of 3 assessments to demonstrate their communication skills, because I want to give them some control over when it's due, which method best suits them. And I think that they really appreciate that. And again, that's one of those things where you're saying, oh, you're trusting me to make a choice, rather than requiring us all to do the same thing.
Yeah. I think in the chat, Danielle, who's just got out of the room, who made a really good point about the fact that it is probably a little bit different at the moment too, in the sense that some of that support we can give in, as you said, Antonella, the curriculum design and how we spread things out and things like that, which I think are great strategies. But a lot of support, when I think back to my time as a student, a lot of my support came from my peers. And because we've been learning online and a lot of students have not even been to campus yet, you know, we are missing that element of student wellbeing support that I think hopefully we'll be able to rebuild from now onwards when we're heading back into campus. But it might take a little while for people to sort of reconnect in the ways where they can rely on their peers for support. And sometimes their peers are great support, and other times their peers may not be the best people to go to because they may not have, again, like not all teaching staff have the ability to support mental health and well-being. Sometimes peers don't either. So definitely sort of really making sure that students are aware of those different channels that the institution can support them in. But hopefully that connectedness and that sense of belonging will be enhanced once we get back on campus.
All right, we are almost out of time, and I know other people, if COVID has taught us anything, we're often doing a lot more lunch meetings and meetings all throughout the day now. I want to thank my Learning Analytics co-presenters, Linda Strecco and Hazel, for coming on board for this fantastic joint webinar. We will put the recording. It will be available on the ASCILITE website as well as the slides. The Business Analytics, the Business Education SIG has another webinar coming up in April, a date to be confirmed, where the Sydney University team will be talking about creating collaborative learning at scale in a project that they've been doing. There's also some other great projects aligned with the Horizons project that ASCILITE is doing. Linda, what's the next learning analytics thing that's coming up if you want to give anything a plug?
Oh, well, we've actually got a series coming up. So for anybody who engaged with us last year, we actually picked a topic last year on ethics, digging deeper into the ethics of learning analytics. And we sort of explored that in lots of different ways throughout the year. So we're about to launch a similar program for 2022, where we're going to be looking at the ways that learning analytics can really help us to understand interaction. So that all the different elements of interaction, student to student, student to teacher, student to content. And so throughout the year, we're going to have a program of workshops, panels and seminars that will help us unpack each of those different areas around how analytics can help us to understand how our students are interacting and how we can then use that to improve their educational experiences. So watch this space. We're going to get some stuff out hopefully in the next ASCILITE newsletter. So for those of you that are ASCILITE members, please do check that email, and we'll have some information about how to join into the first session, which will be happening later in March and or April.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording at this point. Hang on to find the right button. Where is the right button?